Hi guys, welcome to this lecture series on creating value in teams. There are 4 lectures and I'll talk about what the various topics are in those 4 lectures coming up. They're quite short because it's mainly about building your skill and your repertoire of techniques to help improve your teamwork and how to, at the end of the day, create value in the teams. Now, I teach courses at university that often involve group work because the employers that hire our graduates and industry in general value teamwork and the ability of their employees to collaborate with each other. And so teamwork is a no-brainer. If you work in business particularly, you will be working in teams. And that's also true of many other industries, whether it be medicine or engineering, etc., etc. So teamwork is really important. But one of my pet peeves is that at university, even though we give you a lot of teamwork projects or group projects, and we're essentially assessing you on your group work, we never teach you how to work in teams. And so I think this is really unfair because we can't assess group work without having first taught you how to work in teams. The reason why we've been reluctant to teach you how to work in teams is for maybe half of the student population, some of this stuff is already quite obvious because you've been working in teams. But when we have classes of 300 plus, the diversity that is in that student cohort is such that we can't just assume that everyone has the same level of teamwork skills. And so part of the reason I've put together these 4 lectures is to make sure that at a minimum, by the time you've seen these 4, you will all be on the same page in terms of the very essential skills you need in order to be able to create value in teams. So the 4 topics related to group work are collaborating effectively in teams, which we'll look at in this lecture. And then in the second one, we'll look at how to run successful meetings, even though some of you will find meetings pointless and sometimes annoying. So I'll shed some light onto why that might be the case and how do we avoid this. So how do we make meetings that don't feel pointless? Then we'll look at giving and receiving feedback, which is really important when you're working in any group environment. And finally, we'll look at how you might deal with substandard work. So it's quite common in student group projects or even in the real world when you're working with teams within an organization, where someone or maybe several people will be submitting work that appears substandard to the rest of the team. So how do you deal with that? So we'll look at those 4 topics, and each of these are not that long. And we hope that even if you have been successfully working in teams, that you have a quick look at them just to see if you can get anything extra out of it. So much of this is based on executive coaching concepts as well as social psychology. And at the end of the day, if they can help improve you as a person within your organization or within your team project at school or at uni, then that's really the whole point of these sessions. Collaboration. So when you work in a team, the whole reason is to collaborate. Why would you even need to collaborate though? As I mentioned on my lectures in strategy, when you're trying to implement a strategy or when you're trying to come up with a strategy, often you have to collaborate because strategy involves taking an organization in a slightly new direction or trying something that hasn't been done before. And you can't realistically do that on your own. There are always going to be other people that you need to bring with you in order to enact that strategy or come up with a new strategy or carve a new direction for your organization. Even if you're a single entrepreneur, you'll have to consider the consumers that you're trying to serve as well as the suppliers that you need to help you do the thing you want to do in your business. So even at that sort of context where you're a single entrepreneur, you're still going to need to collaborate. So collaboration is a vital part of business and most industries and sectors. So we do need to collaborate in order to get things done. Now humans are really good at collaborating. And if we think about ourselves compared to any other animal that we know so far, I don't think any other species is able to collaborate to the extent that we do. And that, to a certain extent, is why we have gotten to where we are as a species. If you look around, just about everything you see in your daily life is a result of some sort of collaboration. So we know people need to collaborate, and therefore group work and teams are the best way to collaborate. But in saying that, a lot of you will probably kind of hate group work because you might be a star performer and you think, well, this would just be easier if I did it myself. When you start collaborating, some things happen that don't go to plan in your mind, and that frustrates you, and that might make you reluctant to want to work with teams. So the question we're asking is, what hinders effective collaboration? And before I did my PhD in marketing, I actually majored in psychology. So I was a social psych major, and I did my master's thesis on industrial and organizational psychology. And so a lot of that uses social psych and applies it in an organizational industrial setting. And this is also very relevant for marketing and business in general. And the two things that I remember from social psychology when it came to teamwork and working or collaborating in groups is social loafing and coordination issues. So those of you that are doing social psych will probably know what I'm talking about already. But basically, these are the two things that make group work more difficult or not as efficient and as rewarding as it could be. So social loafing, as many of you probably already know or can guess by the concept title, involves people that start to slack off or loaf in a social setting. And so social psychology have done some pretty interesting experiments where they looked at the amount of output that individuals can provide or deliver as individuals when they're held completely accountable for their individual output versus individuals in a group setting, right? And so brainstorming was a classic experiment that I remember doing, where they got us to do, brainstorm ideas as individuals and then brainstorm ideas as a group. And as individuals, on average, people produce more ideas. But as a group, each individual produces relatively less ideas because they're in a group setting. Okay, and so social loafing can occur when people start to slack off because they're de-individuated when they're in a group, and they're no longer held accountable for their output, and so they kind of ease their foot off the accelerator and they don't try as hard because they don't think that they are going to be found out if they haven't been contributing, or maybe they feel that someone else is doing the work as well, so they don't need to work as hard. Now, the whole point of collaborating in teams and doing group work is, in fact, to take off some of that work, to spread the work around. So theoretically, in a group, you shouldn't be going 100% all the time because, the point of a group is that you've distributed the work. But the problem with social loafing is that, you're not doing 100%, but you're doing way less than you would normally do as an individual. And so everyone is essentially not working at their maximum capacity when you chuck them into a group versus if you were assigning a single task to an individual and holding them completely accountable, right? And so that is one thing that prevents groups from collaborating effectively. And there are, I'll talk about some solutions to that very, very shortly. The other issue is coordination. So, the way I think about this is that, social loafing happens when people kind of slack off because they feel like they are either, hidden within the group, or their efforts won't be recognized, or that they aren't really accountable because there are other people sort of disguising their efforts. Coordination, on the other hand, is a little less nefarious, right? So by that I mean that people they're not trying to slack off. It's because they are literally struggling to coordinate their efforts with the efforts of the team and their fellow team members. So the one really good example I have is if you're in a canoe, right, and you're rowing with everyone else. Now, social loafing occurs when a person just sort of rows less hard because they're slacking off and they know that other people are pulling the canoe forward anyway. Coordination issues occur when a person's trying to row really hard, as hard perhaps as they would as an individual, but because they're going at their pace and everyone is going at a different pace, the whole canoe is uncoordinated, and that creates an issue in terms of the efficiency of the vessel, right? And so coordination issues are another reason that hinders collaboration. And there are also solutions to deal with that. So some of these solutions are setting expectations, right? And so setting appropriate expectations within your group early on will prevent social loafing because you're basically setting out the expectations of work commitment, as well as when things will be deliverable, and hopefully the standard at which that work will be delivered. So many of you have heard about these team contracts or group contracts, where we ask you to, put together a contract that each team member signs or at least agrees to, because then that sets the expectations on really basic sort of logistical aspects of teamwork, such as, when do we have meetings, how many meetings do we have, how will meetings be run, how will the group communicate within these meetings, how are we going to approach the milestones that are related to the group project, what is the standard to be expected at each point. So the more clearly you can set out the expectations early on, the more likely you will avoid social loafing, because everyone knows what is expected of their efforts, and the more likely you will be able to coordinate the team as a cohesive unit, because all of a sudden you've got something, in this case a contract or a document, directing the way people should be acting within that group. So setting expectations is really important to avoid social loafing and coordination issues. The other solution is communication. Communication and communication. So I've said that 3 times because it is very important. You're going to have to communicate in order to set those expectations, whether it be verbal communication or written communication. So by communicating, you can, basically call out people if they start to slack, have a discussion about it, what's preventing them from investing the effort that is to be expected, as well as coordination. That requires communication as well, right? And that's why, if we go back to that rowing example, we have a person at the front that calling out the rhythm at which people should be rowing. So they are basically communicating to the rest of the team on how to coordinate their efforts so that everyone's going in the same direction. And it also makes it harder to slack when you're being told when to row, right? So communication is super important, as are setting those expectations, and obviously the two things rely on each other. Now, how to add value as an individual. So the stuff I've talked about before is kind of thinking about, well, how do I manage the other people in the team to make sure they're not slacking and to make sure they're coordinated? But, for you as an individual, how do you add value in the team that you've joined? Now, I've got a thought experiment that I would like you guys to try. And this has come from, my own experience working in teams for many years now. And if you can do this just for a couple of weeks, maybe even just 1 week, and if everyone else in the team can do this thought experiment, it's quite exciting to see how things progress from there. So the thought experiment is to imagine that you are the least important person in the team. So think about that. I want you to imagine that you're the least important person in the team, not the most important person in the team. And so what this thought experiment does is that it flips the script around from you being the center of the universe, or whatever your experience is, and you're now placing everyone else before yourself. And if everyone else in the team is doing the same thing, then essentially the project becomes the central focus of everyone's efforts. And so you start to prioritize the project before yourself, and then you start to take a service approach to your group work. So instead of thinking about how is this going to fit into my life and how am I going to make this as easy for me as possible, you start thinking about, well, what does the project need? What do the other people in my team need in order to do their job? But if they're thinking the same thing as well, then it inherently makes your job easier, right? Because you're all positioning yourselves as a servant to everyone else in the team, and then the project benefits at the end. So if you imagine you're the least important person in the team and everyone else is doing the same, then we see that the project starts to become the core priority and everything starts to funnel that way. And I know in this day and age that's not very, popular advice, because we've been brought up essentially to have, extremely high levels of self-esteem, and confidence is really important, and you got to put yourself out there and make everyone know how great you are and all the stuff that you're fantastic at. And that certainly is, important to have a good sense of self and confidence so that you're not afraid to share your opinions and put yourself out there and try new things, etc., etc. So I'm not downplaying that you are still important as an individual. I'm just saying that for a couple of weeks, for the purposes of this particular group project, I just want you to imagine what would happen if you were the least important person in the team. What would happen if you aimed to serve the other people in your team and they also did the same thing? Then the project theoretically should become the central focus, and that should really start to blossom. The other thing, which is more of a tactical approach, and this works really well in the group project as well as your career moving forward in any organization that you should join, is to provide 3 solutions for every complaint that you have. So this is probably quite common advice you may have already heard. The reason it is really good advice is because when your boss or your employer hires you, they don't just hire you to pick out problems and to tell them what's wrong. Because they either know that already, or if you're coming with them, to them with these problems and not actually providing solutions, then you're just adding to their workload, right? And then you become a person they don't really like to see a lot of, because every time they see you, you've got an issue for them. However, if you bring an issue, but accompany that with 3 solutions, then that shows that you put the effort and homework into thinking about the problem, not just detecting the problem. So it's one thing to detect a problem, that's somewhat valuable, but it's more important to come up with potential solutions for that problem. Because otherwise you just become a person that identifies issues and doesn't really solve any problems, and you're creating more work for everyone. And if you can come up with 3 solutions for everything that you see as an issue, then even if those 3 solutions don't work, at least it's a starting point for a conversation with your employer, your boss, or your other teammates, so that you can actually get the ball rolling to fix that problem. So, those 2 things: imagine you're the least important person in your team, and try to come with some solutions to every problem that you detect. That is, I think, some pretty good advice for not only this group project, but also for any career that you end up going into.